Tonight, we are going to be speaking about the future of strategic restraint after the conflict in Ukraine. Our guest is Michael Brenes, who serves as the interim director of the Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy and is a lecturer in history at Yale University. Welcome, Dr. Brenes.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so for those of you in the audience, throughout our conversation, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask questions or to upvote others' questions you'd like to hear. I'll be keeping an eye on them, but I'd like to lead off here. So in a recent essay that was widely republished, you questioned George Packer's argument in a big article in The Atlantic that more or less the war in Ukraine represents a moment for the revival of liberal internationalism. So what did he get wrong?
How much time do you have? No, I mean, I think, first I should start off with what I think Packer did right, isn't that he, if you read the essay carefully, he's actually accepting the premise that the United States cannot be a global hegemon in the same way that it was prior to Ukraine, that is the war on terror, the way the United States waged the war on terror, nation building, trying to pursue terrorists to the ends of the earth. That's simply not possible in this moment. And so he, as a liberal internationalist, though, believes that the United States still has a pivotal, if not the pivotal role to play in shaping the world. So what he argued, if my memory serves correct and my interpretation is correct, is that ultimately that Ukraine and the assistance that the United States has given to Ukraine provides a model for how the United States can manage global affairs and can essentially support democratic movements or democratic governments without getting involved in nation building quagmires like Afghanistan and Iraq, that we don't have to be engaging in preemptive invasions, et cetera, et cetera. I think there are a couple of things wrong with that. One is this, the overarching problem for me is that he still thinks that the United States has to manage the world and that the United States has a fundamental role to play in managing the world. I don't think that's possible in this moment. I don't think the United States should be doing that. I don't think it's in the best interest of the United States to be trying to do that. And I don't think, even to Biden's credit, I don't think Biden is trying to do that through Ukraine. I don't think he's certainly, through China policy, which we can get into, through China policy, he's trying to assert U.S. hegemony there. But I think through Ukraine, he's not seeing in the same terms. So that's one problem. I think the second problem for me is that he believes that just by engaging in security assistance, ultimately that won't cause any problems for the United States. And what we've seen historically, and I'm a historian, so I think in these terms, is that security assistance can often lead to conflagrations escalating to the point that the United States feels that it has to commit troops. And we can point to various incidents throughout history. I mean, Vietnam, I think, is a big one. Here, if we want to talk about that, and of course, he would say, I think Packer would say, like, well, of course, we learned the lessons from Vietnam. We learned the lessons, from escalating or into a conflict. But I think that to me is paramount in thinking about committing arms or committing weapons to countries to stave off autocratic threats can lead to greater problems for the United States. And there are other problems, but I think I'll in the interest of brevity, as much as I can. I think that the problem for me, what I tried to draw in the piece, was this idea that he thinks restraint is dead, that Ukraine has killed restraint as a basis for foreign policy. And for me, I don't think that's evident. I mean, and I try to bring this out in the piece where I think Biden, for reasons that have everything to do with the fact that he wants to head off a nuclear conflict, that Biden has engaged in some form of restraint. It's not a restraint-based foreign policy, of course, and Biden's not a restrainer, but I think he has engaged in elements of restraint. And therefore, and Packer, he himself is admitting that the United States can't do what it did, as I said earlier. And what I tried to say in the piece was ultimately that, and we can get into this too, if you want, was that restraint is actually, in my lifetime, quite viable as a basis for foreign policy in ways that it hadn't been, even despite Ukraine and what Ukraine's done to shift the conversation, rightfully so, to a certain direction in foreign policy. But that there's an effort, I think, amongst restrainers to create this coalition of the willing, if you will, to push back and to do things to question the premises of U.S. foreign policy and how we engage with the world in ways that Packer, as much as he might want to write it away, can't. And I think that is then incumbent upon us as restrainers, and I consider myself a progressive restrainer of sorts, to come up with an alternative strategy and to put something forward that can be built upon as we think about where Ukraine goes and ultimately how the conflict unfolds and eventually it will end, right? And I think restrainers have to have something, a singular document or documents that people can point to, policymakers can point to say this is a vision for what comes after Ukraine, and that's what I tried to do in the piece. So, Packer's wrong. There's other reasons why he's wrong, but I'll save that. Maybe some of the people in the audience can bring that up. But
yeah, so even if Packer is wrong, though, I mean, there has been a whole lot of critique aimed at restrainers recently. I mean, maybe I spend too much time on NAFO Twitter, but it seems like the discourse space has really narrowed. That, for instance, it is very unfashionable to say that the expansion of Western institutions like NATO toward Russia has contributed to security competition in that area, even though that's something restrainers have tended to argue. Sure. Similarly, things like that Congressional Progressive Caucus letter about the conflict in Ukraine a few months ago ended up being withdrawn amid this kind of furor with a lot of barbs being aimed at them for saying a lot of stuff that was not all that different from what the Biden administration itself was saying, and not really calling for anything like, say, cutting off Ukraine or even putting much pressure on them to negotiate. So doesn't it seem like restraint itself has been restrained by the environment, and that there's maybe less opportunity than there was in, say, January of 2022?
No, I don't discount that point. I think there's something to be said about that. That there was a time, post Afghanistan, I think, was the moment where it was the high tide of restraint. That what comes next is a big question mark, and this was also occurring though within the context of rising. Escalating, I would say, more hyperbolic rhetoric towards China, and Biden and his foreign policy towards China has contributed to this. I think you have to see both as interacting with each other and creating an obstacle to restrainers. That is not just Ukraine and the shock of the war and what it did to, again, rightfully so, raise issues about what the United States should and should not do, and that we need to support Ukraine. It's a clearly an illegal war, and it's going to destabilize Europe, and it's bad for American economic interests. There's all sorts of reasons why I think support for Ukraine was necessary, but that also coincides with, as we've seen very conspicuously over the past couple of days, of this China threat that materializes in the form of a balloon floating over the Midwest. I think that, to me, and the rhetoric that I hear and read on Twitter is, to me, very concerning. And that what you have two things coinciding that I think that's a problem for restrainers, is that you have this kind of Cold War era Red Scare-ish type rhetoric towards China that feeds xenophobia, nationalism, and forces myopic thinking in terms of strategy, in terms of what comes next in the ways that after Ukraine, in the ways that I alluded to earlier and wrote about in my piece. But it's, and then combine that with the situation in Ukraine. I think, to me, going forward, that's the bigger problem now for restrainers is the China issue, because what we see with the war, that first couple of weeks and that first month or two, really, you're right. There was a reevaluation of what restraint could be and could not be in the wake of those 2 months, and people some restrainers, both on the left and the right, did not handle that well, I think, in my view. The way they reacted to Ukraine and just kind of doubled down on NATO expansion. Maybe I think there's a point there, but that to me wasn't productive. And I think we kind of lost a moment there in those first 2 to 3 weeks. And again, even beyond that. But we can't get that back. That's kind of my point of the piece, was we can't get that moment back. Let's think about going forward. And the way that the war has unfolded in Ukraine, to me, shows that this is going to be a war of attrition. There is no solution outside of diplomatic agreements, of a negotiated settlement. I hope that the Ukrainians will prevail. The United States keeps sending. It seems like it's going to do that despite a Republican-controlled House. The United States if it keeps sending arms to Ukraine, that's just going to prolong the war. In some ways, a diplomatic negotiated settlement is great, but I think the bigger problem for me is China and what that does to now that the war has not has materialized in a way that we recognize is sort of, well, there is going to have to be some sort of diplomatic resolution. China, to me, that's the long war. That's the long conflict, and great power to competition being the framework for how we understand China, and that just reviving Cold War era notions of what foreign policy is and what the United States can do within that framework, to me, is concerning. So there's a question of what comes after Ukraine. There's also a question of, like, how do we head off China? And the two, I think, again, are mutually inclusive as opposed to exclusive, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, and let's stick on that China theme for a second. In the State of the Union address last night, there was very little about foreign policy, but one of the things was Biden said, "We seek competition, not conflict with China, and that winning the competition should unite all of us." Those are two quotes from him. Now, you've been kind of expressing concern about this framework of competition and about the kind of Cold War 2.0 mentality. So maybe go into a little more detail on the challenge you see there and what you think would be a better framework, for addressing, what is a very capable state that doesn't always have friendly intentions towards the United States.
Yeah, so before this piece that you referenced earlier about the future of restraint, I wrote this piece for Foreign Affairs with Van Jackson on, I think our editor at Foreign Affairs gave it the title of "Great Power Competition is Bad for Democracy." And what I heard in that State of the Union address last night, as you said, there wasn't very much foreign policy in it. But what I heard was this notion that Biden saying, I'm not going to apologize for investing in the United States to outcompete with China. And yes, we don't seek conflict, we seek competition, but why are we seeking competition for the sake of seeking competition? And what does that mean? On what terms are you competing, right? I think that's also, to me, problematic in the sense that, from my perspective, it's competition just for the sake of competition on economic, military, political terms, and there's not a selection of what are our priorities, right, within competition. But I would say ultimately, first, the idea that we just need to outcompete China is historically not going to go well for the United States. And I referenced the Cold War in the piece that I wrote with Van for Foreign Affairs. We referenced the Cold War as an example for how great power competition during the Cold War didn't play out very well, and mostly related to domestic issues and domestic problems. That this idea that great power competition is going to revive the spirit of cooperation and going to end polarization and create jobs that through the CHIPS Act and things like that. Like that to me is problematic, and I've said this, I've used this word before, but to me, what that does in historical terms, it furthers inequality in various ways, but it furthers racial inequality and economic inequality in ways we can get into. So the idea that great power competition is going to be a boon to the United States and be an effort to revive democracy, I don't think is going to bear weight, come to fruition. So that's one point I would make. And the second thing I would make in terms about competition, more related to foreign policy, Biden kind of got at this a little bit, but again, as you said, didn't really talk about foreign policy altogether that much, was, competition, in my view, as it relates to China, is ultimately, a way to kind of further American hegemony. They don't want competition for the sake of competition and sort of saying like, well, let's just let China compete for these resources or for the South China Sea. We are in a position as the United States, I think, under Biden, is trying to assert American dominance over the South China Sea and exert dominance over Chinese supply routes and things like that are threatening to the Chinese, and the Chinese will then respond. So it's not competition in the sense of, we recognize that there are different interests. And I think there is something to that, and we let those interests lie, and we compete on terms that we can compete. It's, well, we're going to encroach on China's territory, and that's not good. We wouldn't want the Chinese to do that to us, and we don't want to do that to them, because then that's going to escalate into a conflict. So if we're talking about what to replace this with, I would say ultimately as you said, there are some points where the Chinese and the United States, the Americans and the Chinese, the United States and China, we will not converge. Our interests will not align. That's a fact. Do we need to compete over that? I don't think so. But the point is ultimately recognizing that there must, as I see it, there's also recognition that there are points of convergence and cooperation that must be pursued. That is on climate change, that is on pandemic response, that is on illegal drugs, things like that, that are affecting both the United States and China and the broader world. Those factors, those issues, we won't see traction on them unless the great powers, both China and the United States, are invested in making, ending climate change, in reversing climate change, in preparing for the next pandemic. And the rhetoric of competition, to me, doesn't get us there. The framework of great power competition doesn't get us there. We don't have a means to understand, again, our priorities in terms of our foreign policy, which, in my view, should be these global issues, climate change above all, and how that's going to affect countries that fall outside of this great power competition framework that is much of the global South, which, to go back to your earlier question, has largely stayed out of the Ukraine conflict for various reasons, due to Russian oil interests or whatever. So to me, I think there must be a recognition that we cooperate with China. We try to cooperate with China with the expectation that maybe things won't happen, but we at least have to reject the overarching, the rhetoric of competition that envelops U.S. foreign policy, that determines U.S. foreign policy, I would say, and then find points of cooperation with countries who don't fall, again, within this framework of great power competition and can be relied upon to make a better world beyond what we have now.
Yeah, well, related to that, you argued in the original article we were talking about that restraint must be instrumentalized for a new U.S. foreign policy. It's not an end in itself, that it will not thrive simply as the critique or opposition to liberal hegemony, and that its resonance cannot lie in waiting for America to make mistakes abroad. Mm-hmm. So what do you mean, and how should this shape Restrainers' aims?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to the point that I made about the early days and weeks and months of the war in Ukraine, where it seemed to be that Restrainers were on the defensive. And as you said earlier, like on Twitter, Restrainers are on the defensive. Whenever I tweet, not whenever, but often when I tweet about Quincy or when I tweet about Restraint, I get someone in my comments basically saying mean things to me. People say mean things on Twitter all the time, but it's by people who I otherwise respect, right? And I think there is something to be said about the fact that someone like Packer is out there in the ways that he's doing it are wrong, I think. But Packer is out there offering an affirmative strategy for what liberal internationalism can be, after Ukraine. And there, to me, wasn't that. There wasn't this sense of, okay, let's get out of the tyranny of the moment. Let's step back and think about how historically wars end. Let's also think about possibilities for being on the offense as opposed to defense. That is, yelling at this, the most ridiculous thing that, Robert Kagan says or somebody like that says online, and trying to, rise above the noise and create something that people can point to when the question is invariably asked, what is restraint now? People can point to and say, this is a document of principles, of a vision, of a strategy. I teach grand strategy. Like that to me would be something that's productive and useful, as opposed to being mired in this current condition that we're in, which is, feeling again defensive and feeling like, well, waiting for the right moment for restraint to come along again. And that was the problem for me in the first place with the way things were during the war on terror, is that it just seemed to be a situation where we were just waiting for things, waiting for a moment to materialize for us, and it didn't happen until Afghanistan. I mean, there was, of course, the critique of the forever wars and the way that Obama pursued his drone program, and we saw the very naked effects of what that did to the United States and to countries that that we bombed during that drone program. And just the way in which our foreign policy in the Middle East unfolded, there was a critique there, but it seemed to me that we were just sort of pointing out critiques and pointing out problems of that foreign policy. And then here comes Afghanistan. Now we have a moment, and this is our time to shine. And I don't want to wait around for that moment again, because people will die in the process. Countries will be, conflicts will escalate. And I think. It's a very hard climate. It's a very difficult climate in Washington right now. But if you don't bang your head against the wall trying to make change, then you're sort of resting on your laurels. And I'd much rather do the former as opposed to the latter. And maybe it won't make inroads at the moment. Maybe it won't have traction. But at least when there is a moment that comes along, and or there is a person, a policymaker that comes along and asks what is restraint, we can offer something significant. And that's why. I called for restrainers to kind of come together in a conference setting or some sort of coalition or organization to come together and create a document of sorts, or documents that specify in certain terms what restraint-based foreign policy means as it relates to China, as it relates to Russia, as it relates to climate change, as it relates to Ukraine, like all these different problems that we're facing. I think there's a national security strategy document. That's the reflection of the Biden administration. I think restrainers kind of need something too. Right now, we're in desperate think tanks. We're in desperate universities. We have pieces that we write that get put out online and get shared, but there needs to be, I think, a consortium of sorts where we can put our best minds together and think through things and be an affirmative voice for a new foreign policy.
Yeah, and you had suggested like there should be, a document like this should be produced by progressive restrainers specifically, and maybe refreshed every 4 or 8 years or so. What do you think the contents of such a document would be? Like, are there core principles that you think would really stand out, or any things that would really be central, giving us kind of a preview of what that might look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think Matt Dess has said this before. I think where ultimately progressive foreign policy is kind of I think he said this in this piece with Wertheim, or maybe Stephen Wertheim that has said it, which is ultimately progressive foreign policy thinks about what's in the best national interest of the United States and what will protect the American people, will sort of protect the security of the American people. And if you go beyond that, you would think ultimately, like, what can we do to cause the least harm at this moment to the world, right? How can we further the interests of the American people, further national security of the American people, and do so in a way that not just causes least harm abroad, but also thinks about the way our actions affect other populations abroad. And I think that has to be a cornerstone of American foreign policy in the future, is that we have had for too long a foreign policy that thinks in terms of threats, that thinks in terms of competition, that thinks in terms of how we can use our military option first and diplomacy second. And I think any progressive foreign policy that I would envision would first think about the ways in which diplomacy and international cooperation can be used to further the interests of not just the United States, but again, the broader world. And to me, that therefore means you must prioritize global issues like climate change, again, like pandemic relief, like the international drug trade that goes beyond like a war on drugs kind of thing, and poverty, right? Economic injustice, racial injustice. These are global issues. They obviously don't affect just the United States. And this then can become the basis for, I mean, some would say this is utopia or another version of liberal internationalism that's just more lofty and ambitious. But I think that can become the basis for something that is new and progressive and can offer ways to or avenues we can get out of competition. I don't think great power competition is going to be, as much as I think it should be, overturned or rejected. It's not going anywhere. But I think what we have, I think the challenge for us, or for me as a progressive restrainer, and for those who think like me, is how we create a foreign policy within this climate, within this context of great power competition. And I think a document that specifies these principles and offers new ideas on global issues that don't have to be put in again, this US, China, Russia framework, that create the most or do the most good for the most people. I think that would be something that I would like to see. I don't know. I haven't thought out in specific terms what policies would be, but I think that's the point, is to say we don't have that. We're kind of starting from ground zero in some ways in this regard. And I think like there are several ideas out there what a progressive foreign policy can be, like Stephen Wertheim's piece in Foreign Affairs, but there isn't something that we can point to as a singular document. And I think that would be something that should be a mission of somebody or some group of people going forward. Again, if we're interested in offering ideas or propounding propounding new ideas, I think that's where we could go, where we can make an impact in this very, or somewhat at least, restrictive climate towards restraint.
Yeah, I think that idea that you kind of put as one of the kernels here of having, reducing the harm the United States is doing abroad, it gets to an interesting critique I've seen from some progressives in places like Ukraine or Taiwan, saying essentially like, yeah, there are all these mistakes of commission that the United States has made, things like invading Iraq that were extremely harmful, but that if you aren't supporting us, or if you're, say, undertaking bilateral efforts with, the great power that threatens us, about your support for us, that you're kind of selling us down the river, and that we are not, that is not progressive, that there would be essentially a failure of solidarity or a kind of crime of omission. What do you make of that kind of argument? Because I've seen it get a lot of traction.
I mean, I think to me, what's resonated with me is this idea that I used to be, in my younger years, I used to be much more, I'm used to be much more utopian. I used to be much more ambitious. I used to be much more like, let's remake the world kind of thing. And at this point in my life and career, I'm ultimately in a position where I think if progressive restrainers, and this is again something that Stephen Wertheim has said, if progressive and I think Daniel Bessner too, if progressives don't talk about national interests and what's best for the United States first, then they can't get traction on other issues in a Washington D.C. foreign policy making context. They can't get traction on other issues that they care about because it won't resonate within a community of people, a circle of people who think first and maybe ultimately last about what is the national interest of the United States. And we can talk all day about the fact that the United States has, a willingness to engage in diplomacy with countries who have horrible human rights abuses. So Saudi Arabia perhaps being the most blatant example. And then talk all day about democracy in other forms or furthering human rights in other countries. But I don't think that gets us anywhere. I don't think just sort of pointing out and say, okay, we pick and choose which countries we think we should be aligned with, and we think ultimately and allied with, and we think that whatever is in the best interest of the United States, vis-a-vis democracy is therefore the best interest of democracy writ large. That's a problem. Yeah, but it doesn't get us anywhere. So I'm all about thinking in terms of solidarity, and I do think that there's something to be said about progressives as thinking sort of a solidaristic kind of way about issues like that I talked about, particularly climate change. But I don't think you can build a new foreign policy from that basis at this moment. Hopefully we can get there. But to me, what that does is ultimately get you away from the clear and present obstacles to having any residence or having any salience within DC. And things in this framework, things have to start there. You have to start from where people are at as opposed to where you think they should be. And so when I think about progressivism, progressive foreign policy, I think to me that's the language you first have to speak in. It's like, how is climate change, pursuing international climate change through a framework of cooperation in the best interests of the United States? And I can point to various different ways as to why that is the case. And it reduces conflict. It creates jobs on an international scale. We can talk about, all sorts of other types of non-military options for pursuing climate change, not just, putting solar panels on aircraft carriers and things like that. We could also say that's in the national interest of the United States, and that's baby steps. But I think, to me, that's where you have to begin first. And so talking in ways that say, well, unless we're building a global movement premised around solidarity, we're not getting anywhere. I don't think those things are exclusive to one another. I think either you can think of that where I'm at is one step to getting there, or you can think you can, as I would, pursue both simultaneously. That you can get some traction with bringing coalitions or creating coalitions or bringing people to your side, convincing them that you have a role to play or they can play a role in foreign policy making, but then you have to talk to people in DC and you have to make inroads with them. So that's where I'm at in my career in life, is accepting the limits of where we are and trying to figure out how we can, if we can put it in these terms, use the framework of great power competition against those who promote it, like how we can take portions of that framework and mobilize it on our behalf, to our best interests.
Yeah, speaking of this kind of restraint coalition and coalition building, it's you're talking about building a progressive kind of restraint national security strategy. What about the kind of left-right element of the restraint coalition? Because there's clearly several different, political threads that have come together that favor, kind of a less adventurous U.S. security policy. But they also can have very different philosophical foundations.
Mm-hmm.
How rich do you think the cooperation is that's possible, and how how can progressives, for example, think about how to engage in that when, for example, there was a lot of controversy during the Trump administration when he, started some of the balls rolling toward withdrawing from Afghanistan, talked about withdrawing from Syria, but also did a lot of things that progressives didn't like.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, I'm a non-resident fellow at Quincy, which is a transpartisan organization. I think there is something to be said about transpartisan alliances, particularly at a moment when, we're not at where we want to be, right? As restrainers or progressive restrainers, right? I think what Quincy offers is a space for like-minded and people who aren't so like-minded to come together around certain issues. And I think that's important and that's needed. And that's not going to go away. And I don't want it to go away. Particularly again, at a moment of building, which I think we'll be in for quite some time, of building networks and building connections and making inroads in policymaking. I think what might happen is that restrainers, and I think this is already the case, restrainers might have fissures around certain ends, right? The ends that I might want to see, like the means we might share, and that we both believe that is on the right. Those are on the right in the restraint camp. We both believe that the United States should pull back from the world, should not pursue hegemony, should not do, trying to be engaging in a competition with China because we're concerned about declining primacy. The means in which to get there, I think, are can be shared, right? We have different particulars, perhaps, but I think there's shared means. I think the ends is where things are going to get complicated. If and when, like our vision, if we ever have a majority voice in Washington D.C., I think that's where I would see conflict happening. But I think it's productive conflict. I don't think it's conflict that's going to, it's not going to be like the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks kind of thing, where we're going to see a revolution and a revolt over it. I don't think that's the type of direction that we would go in. I'd like to think, at least. And I would also think that if like some elements of a restraint-based coalition on the right get realized, that I wouldn't be willing to fight back against that in the same way as that I would be if they're coming from like liberal internationalists, from the ends that we're pursuing right now, in the sense that, I mean, certain things, what you see is in Congress right now is like Marjorie Taylor Greene, for instance, who should not be supported, in my view, by any restrainer, wanting to cut off aid to Ukraine, right, and wanting to just pull back out of Ukraine because she's marshaling all sorts of rhetoric to do that, much of which makes no sense. I don't think that people should be on the left or the right should be joined in coalition with people like that, who clearly don't care about Ukraine and clearly don't care about U.S. foreign policy and making the world better all that much. I don't think that like the right-based restraint would align with people like with Taylor Greene. I don't think that's. Hopefully not. I don't think that's a viable prospect for people who are in my camp. So, which is to say that as long as the coalition that we have can hold around many issues that I think that have brought us together in the first place, as long as that can hold for time being, that can be useful in getting change to where we want to go. It's a numbers game, right? The more numbers we have, the more powerful we are, and then having our vision realized, I think, is a problem. A conflict that leads to conflict is a problem I'd love to see. That's something that I would love to. A problem I'd like to tackle in ways that obviously, as we know, would, I think, benefit the United States and its foreign policy mission.
Yeah, it would be great to have a peace dividend to be fighting over.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
So another question, kind of sticking with this, like, what does the progressive restraint strategy look like? what about, U.S. Ukraine policy, which is very much the hot topic, both now during the conflict and maybe in moving toward a settlement or shaping a post-war vision. What does that look like? What role should restrainers be looking to play?
I mean, I think in my view, what restrainers can again keep doing is instead of concentrating on the amount of money that's getting sent to Ukraine, which was something that was coming out of the restraint camp, that where's this money? I think one is to say there should be a question of where the arms end up, right? As we're thinking about where the war goes and the evolution of Ukraine as a state. That's out there, but just not doubling down on how much money the United States is spending on Ukraine, I don't think is productive, right, at this moment. Where I see Ukraine policy going, to your sort of larger question, is I think it's going where it's been. It's going where it's been. There is no, in my view, other option for the United States than to keep doing what it's doing, if it is in the interest of the United States to, I would say, not escalate the conflict and not commit troops. We're not going to commit troops to Ukraine. I think what we're doing right now is quite good for Ukraine and for the United States. Biden has, largely committed to. I mean, we're seeing some concessions to this now, but Biden has not committed to sending high-tech weaponry into Ukraine. He's not as committed to, he's not saying we're going to escalate the war in any capacity. I think that security assistance for the foreseeable future is going to be the basis of Ukraine foreign policy. Which is again to say that this is a war of attrition. Russia's going to make inroads in the war. Ukraine's might make gains in response. I don't see that the war is going to dramatically end anytime soon. So this goes back to my point, which is that restrainers, in my view, can not just keep wishing for an end to the war, for an end to the conflict, and say we need to pursue diplomacy now. But to have, when there is a possibility for diplomacy on the table, either on the Ukrainian or the Russian side, there isn't at this point. Who knows what those conditions might be. I think there have to be a substantial losses in the war for either Russia or Ukraine to go to the bargaining table. But to that point, I think there can be, for restrainers, opportunity there to offer something about what a vision for a new post-Ukraine order could be that brings aid and relief and reconstruction efforts, not just to Ukraine, but to other parts of the world. And that Ukraine can be the basis for a larger re-envisioning of what security assistance is and the type of aid that the United States can provide in a framework of global cooperation, at least among the powers that have been sympathetic towards Ukraine, which are Europe and mostly Western Europe and United States and some other countries. But that's at this point not possible. But I try to tease this out in a small piece I wrote on sort of what comes after Ukraine in regards to thinking about a future of distributing wealth, redistributive justice, and Ukraine. The talk of reparations for Ukraine, the talk of forcing Russia to pay for the war, which is echoing back to World War I kind of stuff. That to me is a disastrous path in the terms in which it was discussed. I think if we're talking about reparations or some sort of punitive effort to punish Russia, I don't know if that will do what we want it to do. Again, given that history. So rather than think in those terms, let's think outside of that and think about the ways in which nations can pool their resources together to help rebuild Ukraine and restore democracy in many ways to other parts of the world. And that would be, to me, the basis for a better, more peaceful world outside of competition. Like that's what I'm ultimately interested in, is trying to think about the ways in which the United States can do that through a concert of great powers, because that's the reality that we're in right now. And to me, this is all very fresh. This is all very new. I don't know what that looks like in a programmatic sense. I know that there are avenues out there in the UN and spaces like that. I know that there's thinking along those lines, but to me, I think it's. I don't even see that the Biden administration has thought about what comes after the war, what comes after. I think they barely thought about 6 months from now. That they're playing it as it unfolds, and I think that's not long-term thinking, and it's not useful. And so, Restrainers then can fill in that space that requires long-term thinking and long-term solutions to something like, how do you rebuild Ukraine, or how do you prevent further Ukraine wars? So,
yeah. So you've also written a lot in some of your other work about the Cold War military-industrial complex and its kind of role in the American political economy. So, what's really the core of the argument or the analysis in that work?
So this is my book for Might and Right, came out a couple of years ago. What I tried to argue, but I'm still arguing, still think I'm right, it was that the Cold War created a coalition of interests, both among Democrats and Republicans, sometimes also on the left and the right, depending upon how you frame both the left and the right, that were vested in the military-industrial complex, a permanent military-industrial complex, for either financial or political or ideological gain. And that when we think about the endurance of the military-industrial complex in a quote-unquote long peace, that is the Cold War, I think about it in terms that speak to the ways in which it's not contingent or dependent upon the wars that the United States fights as much as it's dependent upon domestic factors and political economy in the United States, and how much the industrial policy of the United States is tied up into making weapons, into the military-industrial complex. And what I argued in the book is that because of the ways that the Second World War, war production for the Second World War, and even before that, the New Deal provided a boon to employment, provided investment to local economies, provided all sorts of other social benefits. We think about war production during World War II, Black Americans, women getting jobs, unemployment being going from about 14% to about 4% in the matter of a couple of years, that the lessons from that were wartime spending and spending for the military can be a boost to democracy, can be a boon to Americans overall, and can rectify a lot of inequalities that are present in American society. And that is an experience that many Democrats or Cold War liberals, or New Deal liberals who become Cold War liberals, take into a post-war era now, when they think about how the military-industrial complex can provide various responsibilities and roles for not just creating jobs through what's called military Keynesianism, right? The idea that you invest in the military and it creates demand and creates jobs, right? So military Keynesianism as an economic program or as the basis for industrial policy, that it also can provide social mobility, can provide people, Americans with the ability, these are in the defense industry, for the most part, good paying jobs. They're unionized jobs often. You can provide mobility and uplift for many Americans. And that idea really came to shape how we think about the ways in which the military-industrial complex unfolds, evolves, and gets increasingly relied upon into the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s. And therefore, what I tried to show in the book, what I try to show in my overall work, is that once there's this bipartisan consensus around this by the 1950s, that the military-industrial complex is here to stay, that we do need a permanent wartime, a warfare state, or some sort of permanent war economy, that when jobs are cut or when jobs are eliminated in the defense industry, it creates a visceral reaction amongst those who are employed by the defense industry, the military-industrial complex, and it creates an ideological backlash or a reaction amongst those who say, well, we can't cut jobs, we can't get rid of this industry because communism's on the march. And so the lessons there from the military-industrial complex and its history, to me, from the 50s and 60s, 70s, is as the military-industrial complex experiences job losses, and then through Vietnam and other wars, there's a new investment in spending, wartime spending. What people do is they get jobs and they lose jobs, ebbs and flows, and it basically commits them to the military-industrial complex in ways that are interesting for me, because they would say, don't cut my job. And when the job is cut, they say, how do I get my job back? And that is then supported by a group of politicians, local politicians and national politicians, by a group of ideologues. Again, sometimes Democrats, sometimes Republicans. And as the defense industry starts to be in the 1970s, 1980s, within a context of creeping austerity and neoliberalism, as the defense industry starts to experience job cuts too, but it becomes a greater source of stability. At a time when unemployment is rising, inflation is rising, and then Reagan comes along in the 1980s and says, "We're going to have a defense filled up and save jobs." And this is then how I think about the military-industrial complex. So I think about it not just as like a jobs program, but I think about it as having these multiple dependents who would like perhaps an alternative to it, i.e. some defense workers, but still can't envision what that alternative would be, because it would either imperil the national security interests of the United States, or it would mean the personal loss of their livelihood. And this is a very powerful, enduring, durable coalition that we see animates us in the present as we think about great power competition being the framework for U.S. foreign policy, and Biden saying, I'm not going to apologize for creating jobs under the CHIPS Act and other federal legislation to outcompete China in computer chips and microchips, things like that. I'm not going to apologize for that. Then that being a boon to democracy, people being then dependent upon this industry. You're tied into militarism and the militarization of U.S. foreign policy in ways that you as Americans, even if we're not materially dependent upon the military-industrial complex, are and don't want to recognize. And I think that's a powerful thing for me as we think about a very undemocratic, I would argue, undemocratic institution shaping a democratic country and a democratic people.
We've just got a few more minutes, maybe to close out. Who are some other progressive voices in Restraint that you would recommend our audience check out and pay attention to?
There's so many. I would say Stephen Wertheim is one. I'm sure you're familiar with Stephen's work. Matt Duss is another, who's at Carnegie now, is former Bernie Sanders foreign policy advisor. Both Matt and Stephen wrote an excellent piece in The Republic on Biden's foreign policy. I'd also check out Kate Kaiser, who does excellent work on Middle East. Daniel Bessner, who has written some amazing pieces over the years. There's so many. I've even said, I don't know if she's considered herself a progressive, but Jessica Chen Weiss has written some very important pieces of recent months, and her work is fantastic. I mean, that's the thing. This goes back to my point. We're at a moment where I can't envision like 10, 15 years ago, if George Bush gave his State of the Union speech, 2 days from now, we'd be seeing a reaction that says that we're talking about it in these terms. I think being progressive, having a group of progressive restrainers that we do right now that are very visible and doing good work is a testament to the progress that we've made. And I could sit here and list a bunch of other names as I think about them. Lyle's great too. I mean, he's not in the progressive restraint camp, but he's doing excellent work too. I can list a bunch of names, but I think ultimately the point is that we are at a moment where we do have a presence. We do have a very palpable force that can be exerted on the foreign policy making stage, and we should use it to our great advantage. But that's what I'll say about that. There are other people if I think of them, but anyway.
Well, great answer. And we will be hearing from Lyle Jeremy Rubin next week with my colleague, Patrick Fox, hosting. So thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you, Dr. Brenes, for sharing your wisdom with us. Good night, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks. Pleasure.